I don't know. It's just interesting. But to me, it was like that. It's
Hello? Hey, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself.
I can actually hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm on the phone and he's like, hey, can you take yourself off of mute just so you can hear me? Okay. Hey, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself. Yes, I can hear you.
I actually hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm on the phone and he's like, hey, can you take yourself off of mute just so you can hear me? Okay. Hey, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself. Yes, I can hear you.
I actually hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm on the phone and he's like, hey, can you take yourself off of mute just so you can hear me? Okay. Hey, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself. Yes, I can hear you.
I actually hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm on the phone and he's like, hey, can you take yourself off of mute just so you can hear me? Okay. Hey, can you hear me? I just unmuted myself. Yes, I can hear you.
I actually hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm on the phone and he's like, hey, can you take yourself off of mute? Okay, I just unmuted. Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me? Interpreter, can you hear me? Yeah.
I can hear you, but you know what? Whatever it is, it's been playing on a loop.
Right. I noticed that.
Yeah. And so that was weird. But the first time I was gonna reply,
What about the in-person sound?
kept
Because
saying
this is
the
what
same.
matters. Technically, the people joining remotely
Yeah,
don't
try
count
that.
towards quorum.
That's not a bad
Can they
idea.
hear what's happening in the room?
They can hear us.
They can hear
We
us.
just can't. The
We
issue
can't
right
hear
now
them.
is they're sounding muffled.
Then if we have quorum, then I think we need to do it because if this is gonna take
May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
A motion to approve the minutes.
Okay, may I have a motion seconded?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any question, comment, debate? Corrections to be made to the minutes? It appears
No.
there are none, so I'm going to ask that all in favor
Aye.
of approval express so by stating aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. The meeting minutes have been approved and should be entered into the record. So today's agenda is centered primarily on a review and discussion of the public meetings that have been held to date. I first want to thank all of the commission members for joining us for the public meetings and the conversations, the panel conversations that have occurred to date. We have held 3 public meetings in Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. And then we've held several meetings via Zoom with thought leaders, persons with lived experience, and subject matter experts in what we have termed, I guess, transformational foundational conversations, where we're looking at inequity in areas ranging from health and education to environment and land use. We'll be soon looking at legal issues, criminal and otherwise, as well as economics and economic inequity. These meetings, both the foundational meetings, also early learning foundations. The purpose of these meetings and the public engagement sessions, the purpose is to gather from the community, again, people, everyday persons like ourselves, and then some with expert knowledge, thought leadership in spaces concerning racial inequality and racial inequity, to garner from them what they believe are the issues on which the commission should be centered. The aim is to hear as much as we can and to learn as much as we can, and then to take those learnings, and identify themes, and then the themes that then relate to underlying structural issues. That's the work of the commission, to center on structural issues. I'm going to pause for a minute and note the presence of Vice Chair Henry Garrido. Good to see you. Glad you're here. And understand you've had some traffic challenges, so we're glad you're here. Today's conversation is going to center on what we've heard to date in these conversations. Essentially, we want to hear from the commission members what their observations are, having heard from the public and thought leaders, and we want to hear your thoughts about what is rising up with respect to themes and underlying structural issues. The leadership team, led by Executive Director Nisha Venkataraman and our Policy Director, Jimmy Pan. I'm saying Pan, and in my mind, I'm like, am I saying that right? So thank you. Jimmy Pan are going to walk us through essentially a summary of what we've heard thus far and guide us in a conversation centering on emerging themes and the next steps for our work to essentially take those themes and then translate them into, or use them to delve into, underlying structural issues. And then they'll talk to us a little bit about the next steps that are underway for each and every one of us as commissioners. Again, I want to thank all of the commissioners for all that they've done. You've been present in the meetings, both online and in person, and it just demonstrates your commitment to this work. And I think the community, I can't speak for the community, but I'd like to think that they appreciate your having been a part, your being present. And I think it says a lot to the staff as well, who have played an instrumental role in getting us here and getting us through every meeting. I mean, yeoman's work that the staff has undertaken to make sure that we are engaging in the way that we should. So without going on and on and on. Let's turn to our executive director, Anusha Ben-Katraman, for a walkthrough report on the public engagement and what is resulting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chair. I will start with just a brief update of what we have done to hear from the community, hear from thought leaders, hear from leaders and practitioners in communities. If you're looking at the slides, which we have distributed in person and also uploaded on our website for members of the public to view, this would be slide 4 and slide 5. We are about midway through, or almost midway through, our Transforming Foundations issue area panels. These are the panels where we have invited key thought leaders and practitioners to share their recommendations and also the barriers and issues that they see that stand in the way of racial equity and racial justice. There have been 6 to 10 panelists per session to date, organized into 2 to 3 panels of speakers. We have heard from folks on overcoming racial disparities in health and mental health, eradicating education inequity for BIPOC communities, achieving racial equity in housing and land justice, planning for a racially equitable future just last week. And we look forward to shortly sharing with you what we heard in terms of content at those sessions. Just want to highlight the upcoming sessions we have tomorrow: economic equity and closing the racial wealth gap. Then this Friday, racial equity and early foundations, which builds on our education equity panel, which was a few weeks ago, followed by 3 more sessions to close out by the end of the month. Want to thank commissioners who've recommended speakers for those panels. They have been incredibly enlightening and helpful so far, certainly for the staff. I hope for commissioners as well. And we're looking forward to the remaining ones. Just as a reminder to everyone, folks are able to join and watch all of these panels publicly. Links can be found on our website, and I encourage anyone watching or listening here today to do so. They have truly been quite beneficial. And I see that we have some edits actually to what is written in the slides. Ensuring a fair and just legal system for all persons is actually on the 17th. And that's it. Moving to communities and the general public. We have started our tour of New York City. It's going quite well so far. We were in Staten Island just 2 weeks ago, then in Brooklyn and in Queens. And this Wednesday we'll be in Manhattan, followed by the Bronx the week following on the 19th. And then we'll have 3 citywide engagements that are really for anyone around the city who is able to join, wants to share their stories, their input, their ideas with the commission directly. It's a great time to get some face time with the commission. Commissioners have been engaging actively, asking questions, sometimes probing questions. So want to thank you for your engagement there, and continue to encourage any member of the public to come out. The 3 citywide ones, one of them will be in person at a location to be confirmed, and 2 of those will be virtual opportunities for people to be able to testify over Zoom. So at this point, we're going to move to the substance of what we have heard. We'll be recapping our input. And as you know, since you've been at, I think all of you have been at most of the sessions, some of you at all of them, we've heard a lot of input. It's been a lot of information. And there are many different ways that we could have organized the input that we've heard today. Since our commission is really focused in on making foundational structural change, we thought the first step would be to look for patterns. What are the patterns? What are the themes that are emerging across input that we've received via testimony and via expert panels? Those patterns can begin to help us to identify the root causes that are causing those barriers, causing those issues that folks are raising. So we're presenting these themes here today to begin to move us into that direction of what those structural changes may be to help us surface those structural roots that continue to perpetuate inequity in our city. So we hope that this is a helpful way of presenting the information to you. It really encapsulates the synthesis of especially those 4 issue area panels, 2 additional public input sessions. I will note that we are starting to receive input from city agencies and city agency staff. We've saved that information to present together at a later date at a future commission meeting. So this really represents community input sessions to date, with the exception of Queens, which has not been entered yet. So I think, did I cover all the framing here? This is now on slide number 7.
Yeah, if I may, just want the commissioners to keep in mind that at this particular point in our process, we are framing key themes, but that does not necessarily translate into a theme will result in a structural change that looks exactly like the theme that is put forward. Said differently, we may see that we have, what's a good example? I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head. A theme that might present, and maybe we'll wait and go through this, but I guess what maybe we'll use an example when we get to it. What I'm really getting at is that I don't want you to center so much on this theme is now going to translate into a specific structural change in the charter. That theme may pinpoint an underlying issue that has to be addressed. So the theme itself, we may be looking at education, lack of cultural humility, cultural competence, right? But when you go to the charter, you will not necessarily see anything centered on cultural competence. And so I just want you to keep thoughts and ideas in your head and really center on what does it mean what is the underlying root of the problem? Themes are helping us to pinpoint underlying root problems, but the theme itself may not be the solution.
So, Madam Chair, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of those areas is where the state and federal governments have a lot to say in how we implement and distribute resources, particularly the example of the New York City Housing Authority is an example. There is clearly inequity there, but that's something that there's limitations what we would be able to do in the charter itself. And I think one of the hardest things we're going to have to do is that we synthesize all of these themes is how do we begin to reduce the issues that are charter bound for changes as recommendations to the commission, and also look at policy issues that may still be pursued,
right? That
are, clearly underlining an inequity and a structural racial, deficiency that we have in the system, but that are more policy bound than it is a true charter amendment.
That's right.
And I think that that's going to be one of the hardest parts of it.
It's going to be very
as a
challenging.
start, this is a great part.
Absolutely. And we have to continually orient and reorient ourselves to appreciate that we are looking at policies, but when it comes to the charter itself, we're looking at how policies are enabled or disabled by the charter. Our work is in terms of structural change, it's the charter that enables, allows for that which is, that which we need to do away with, or will allow for us to do that which needs to be done. And then that gets manifest sometimes in policy and in program. Doesn't mean we're not going to pay attention to policies as well. But if we're going to root out the problems, we've got to look at the structural underpinnings. And I'll just quickly give, I'm not going to get into too much personal, but I'll give an example that I was sharing with one of the staff and with Anusha. I learned when I had cancer that the doctors believed was environmentally caused, that I had a cavity in my lung. And they believed that the cancer with the lung was the result of something that happened environmentally. They gave me antifungal medication while I was going through a bone marrow transplant to ensure that I would not get a fungus that would penetrate the cavity. 10 years later, I began to cough up blood. Now, they could have continued giving me antifungal medication because they found it was a fungus that had penetrated the cavity. But they would have to keep doing that over time. It was treating the problem, but it wasn't addressing at its core. So what they determined to do was to go into my lung and cut out the wedge of the lung that had the cavity in it, that had the hole. They cut out the root problem. And now I'm living, as I said, with 1 2/3 lungs, but I don't have a cavity, I don't have a problem, and I don't have anything that, you know, can cause further problems or allow the problem to persist. We're going in to cut out the core problems that allow for these things to persist. So now you know a little bit more about me than maybe you needed to, but I think it's a very clear and analogous, easy to understand example. And you can live with 1 2/3 lungs.
Absolutely. Thank you for that example, and for setting the stage for what we will go into. I think beyond what we are capable of taking on within the charter, we're also presenting more themes that we will be able to take on. So this is food for thought to help us get to those structural underpinnings. You will see the 13 themes that have emerged so far. As we move along, some of these may be collapsed or overtaken by other themes. There may be others that will emerge. For instance, we have not held our economic equity panel yet. So I would anticipate that next time around, we will see some more themes that move in that direction. So with that, I will hand it over to Jimmy to present the content.
Thank you. Ooh. So I'll walk you through the themes that the staff have been working to identify. Can you all hear me okay? Great.
There is a little something you, perhaps if you can use Anusha's mic. Sounds a little.
All right, is that a little better?
Yes.
Great. So just to reemphasize, these are themes that the staff brought out from the many, many hundreds of ideas we've already heard and the issues that we've already heard. And we brought these 13 themes together as a way for you to organize your own thoughts and reflect. And so I'm gonna run through these. They're in alphabetical order, not order of importance. And certainly the themes can change. So for those at home, we're at slide 8 right now. And that first theme is accessibility of government services to all. So the
Jimmy,
way,
before you go any further, just please clarify for us, do you want to go through every theme before we have discussion? Or would you like commissioners to comment as we go?
let's go through a few at a time and then
Okay.
pause.
Good
Does
deal.
that sound good?
Yes, thank you.
Right. So the way we've organized these slides for you all is to have the session in which the underlying ideas came up so that you can remember, oh, this relates to health. Someone was mentioning that. This came up during education. This came up during the planning panel. It's so that you can connect those ideas. And that's to the left of the slide. To the right of the slide, there's the stakeholders who may have mentioned an idea that, again, is tied back to this theme, but I won't read those stakeholders out to you. So if you have the slide, you can see it for yourself. So what did we decide to put under this theme of accessibility to government services for all? So we heard a lot of comments in both the health and education panel about the lack of diverse or culturally competent, culturally humble staff, and that contributes to disparities. We heard that the services provided by government are not always themselves culturally relevant or responsive to cultural needs, and that the systems that we create for people with disabilities or communities in general are not always inclusive of the variety of needs. And of course, we heard a lot about insufficient language access programs that themselves result in difficulty and inequities accessing care, education, services. And of course, in our education panel, we heard a lot about the complexity of navigating school and government services. And that's of course a barrier to BIPOC, immigrant, and disabled communities. So as you hear this, you may recall a lot of the individual ideas and recommendations that came up regarding how education may not be accessible, especially in the health panel, how the services that people receive don't speak to who they are or are hard to access. And so I'm spending a little more time on this theme in particular to show you that even though ideas may come from different panels, we can tie them together in this way and think about what the charter may or may not say about accessibility of services in general. I'm going to move on to the next slide, accountability, maybe a little bit more straightforward, and that came up in our housing panel and our planning panel. So we heard folks talk about how the laws that should protect against racialized discrimination are often not enforced effectively or often. And we heard that the demands of community are often not met because there are limitations in the government process, because they don't have the ability to hold government accountable, or simply there's not substantive discussion when that happens. We heard about the need for greater transparency and accountability in community input in decision-making. And we heard that the inability to track or report because of siloing agencies makes it harder to hold government accountable. Of course, we heard about the lack of legal services, and we also heard that community investment by private entities is encouraged, but that there's not very strong enforcement mechanisms for those. Another theme we heard is budget justice, which gets at how government allocates money or how it chooses to spend the money it does have. And we heard that in housing and the planning panels, as well as in Staten Island and in Brooklyn. What we heard is that, of course, the affordable housing crisis in New York City disproportionately affects BIPOC communities. We heard that certain types of workers, like care work, is undervalued and underinvested. And we heard people say you should reallocate funding from police and jails to fund the services that communities need. And we also heard people mention things like value capture and other ways that we should leverage public and shared assets as an opportunity to invest in racial equity. So why don't I pause there? We've done 3 and see if anyone has questions about those so far or about the way these are organized.
So thank you, Jimmy. What I would ask is that commission members raise their hands if in the room. I don't know if we can yet have any participation. Okay, all righty. So unfortunately, perhaps if Commission Member Davey has a question, he can email it. If you can put if you have a question or comment, Commissioner Davey, if you want to put it in the chat, we can pick it up there and share it with the group. But I'm going to ask commission members in the room to raise your hand, and I'm going to kick us off. As I listened and as I read, there was one overarching thought / concern that came to mind. And this is something I think the commission has to chew on the whole. And that is, as you presented what we heard, was very government focused. Now, we are a commission appointed by the government, and we are looking at the government charter. But it raised for me the question, government shapes and influences and informs not just what happens by government authorities, government agencies, government workers, but what happens outside with private entities, independent entities. And a lot of what I'm reading reads as though we're just centering on what government is or is not doing. And so I raise that as a caution and as a concern, because this is not just what does government do, the 300,000 plus staff and how they conduct themselves, but what's happening with respect, I'm just throwing it out. What does equity look like in private hospitals versus public hospitals? What does it look like, when we look at education and the experience of children who are in independent schools versus public schools? And what is the role and responsibility of government to ensure equity in that respect? So let's just make note of that. And then looking at the first slide on accessibility of government services to all. You all were putting this together, you've done a great job. But as I read it, what we're really centering on is disparate access to the services for all, because some have no problem getting the best of education services. And what we were hearing is that the lack of cultural competence or cultural humility makes access for some more challenging. So I think we should think about it more in terms of the disparate, how, like that it's disparate and not just overall accessibility. And then going back to my first point, is it disparate access to government services or disparate access to basic human services and economic supports or whatever it is? But you get what I'm saying? It's beyond government. We're talking about what government's responsibility is, but it's not just the government service about which we're concerned. So those are my two initial points. Are there commissioners that have other thoughts or points they'd like to raise? Vice Chair Garrido?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I have I guess a question around the line. You mentioned the issue of health and disparity. One of my biggest concerns is how we prioritize these items, right? So these are all obviously organized in a way that make a lot of sense based on the testimonies that we've heard, but they're not organized in any particular order. And I guess my biggest concern with what we saw with the Charter Commission revision last time on the ballot measures, that there were all these questions on the line, subset of ideas, and when you vote for everything underneath, whether you agree with the entirety or not, right? I could have agreed with questions 3 to 4, but may have questions or concerns about the 4th one. And I want to make sure that we're not going in that direction unless the entire commission understands what the subset of those issues. I'm not against particularly putting one idea and then a subset of ideas, but it seemed that time, and this was my public criticism of the previous idea, not that I didn't devalue the work, is that there were things that didn't seem to align with the theme in the first place. So you had a big subset and then you have 4 or 5 different things underneath. And one of them seemed to be completely alien to the discussion of the subject. And I just want to make sure that we don't go down that path again. To have people have to be forced to say, well, I may agree with 80% of the concept under the issue of health or housing or education, but then I have to vote for it, even though I disagree with the 20%. This sentence that represents 20% of the value of what is being ascribed to that particular idea. And so while I applaud Jimmy and the staff for doing this, I want to make sure we're not going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. I just want to affirm that these 13 themes do not in any way align with the questions we will end up with. This is to help us get to that point of a smaller number of finite, structural, meaningful, long can make. This is just an initial stab at organizing what we have heard. So I just want to affirm that. Thank you.
Commission Member Favors?
I echo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I echo the appreciation for the work that's gone into this. And as I look at the accessibility of government services, in particular, what comes across to me is that while yes, there is an inequity in accessing services, it also feels as though there is a thread of inability to equitably access the levers of power that determine what the distribution of services should look like, and that are able to then make corrections through that distribution. So it's the services, yes, but I think if we only focus on ensuring there is equitable receipt of services without ensuring that there is equitable ability to manipulate the various levers of power, be they pointed at accountability, be they pointed at reassessing what those services should be, I think we would be missing a key thread that's here. So I just want to point out that in addition to the service provision, when I'm thinking about what an equitable community looks like, when I know that there are some in our community who, in the education context, might have the chancellor's phone number in their cell phone, it's not so much at that point a matter of access to services, it's about who else has access to that particular level of power. And I'm only using that for hypothetical. So I just want to ensure that as we're looking about the equitable access to receipt of benefit, that there's also an eye towards the equitable distribution of the power levers that determine what those benefits look like.
So if I may just jump in here and say to you, Commissioner Favors, that you just modeled, if you will, the work that has to be done. That, the result, essentially these themes, a better way of putting it, thinking about it is the themes that have been presented are the results. Like what, what is happening? We're trying to get at what is it that is causing these things to happen. So inequitable access, one of the root causes of it is inequitable power and inequitable access to power. It's like both ends. Who holds power and who can access power when it comes to decision-making about services in communities. And that's when you get to, when you look at the charter, so how is power distributed? And if we change those dynamics, we have to do so in a way that then you get to see it live out in terms of service delivery and service provision. I think that was a great example. Commission Member Bain. Yes. Mhm.
And I hear you, I hear you on it's hard when things are not in full alignment. 4 or 5 selections, and you say 8%. That might be considerable success. When you think about the words space and mindsets that are represented, so my question then becomes, how do we measure? Where do we bring on the measurement of the successful outcome? When we talk about accessibility, nation accountability, as part of what we want to land, there are several areas that keep the pattern that come up in conversation with Black and brown people talk about the experiences that happen in your city. And so we have this humongous responsibility to listen, to learn from this, but then to figure out where we can make the greatest impact. So I think part of our conversation is we take on this information from community, stakeholders, thought leaders, etc. Where strategically will we position ourselves that will have the greatest outcome for impact, based on the fact that we are looking to revitalize and revision the charter of the university. That is the weapon, that is the tool, that's what we have at our disposal to a certain extent. That being said, I think that's where I want to gain some more insight and understanding, because we can't do everything, but we can do something revolutionary.
So if I may just respond and give you a sense of how I'm thinking about it and how I've been talking with Anusha and with Jimmy about it. The themes that you're being presented help us to begin thinking about, like what are the causes of those things, and then thinking about applying like a theory of change with research. Some of it may be evidence-based and some may just be, kind of innovative and of the moment, right? And what we have to do is figure out what is the tie, what is the relationship of the root cause to the problem? How significant a contribution is it to the problem? So said differently, what has been happening is people are bringing us issues that they are aware of. And sometimes they have solutions for those issues. But the solution that they may be presenting maybe only addresses 30% of the problem, because it's not really getting to the root, to the heart of the matter. So the work that Jimmy, as policy director, and his team will be leading is trying to take these themes and unpack them to do that root cause analysis and then look at, well, if you did these 2 or 3 things, how much might that move the needle? How much do we know based on research and otherwise about whether it's going to move the needle or not? Some of the solutions that have been presented to us are good ideas, but they may simply be like only going to affect 5% of the people who are identifying as having that problem. If we determined an example, the other day we were in a meeting in Brooklyn, and there was an individual who shared that in her agency, she's a city employee, in her agency, there is an issue around hiring and promotions. You remember, you were there.
Mhm.
We could look at what's just happening in her agency and the solution she might proffer and say, oh, that's the fix. But it may be something more underlying and more structural, just like it may be in the examination, it may be in the underlying, who holds power in decision-making about who gets promoted from one city agency to the next. It may be a solution that requires a union, role. But if we just center on, oh, let's just look at this agency and this particular problem, we're not going to get at it. So the work that the policy team has to do, to your point, is to take some of these themes, try to identify what are these themes, and then what's at the core of them, and what's the fix that's going to move the needle, to your point.
So I'm totally in. One suggestion was the construction of a new city agency on race and social justice that would have some type of monitoring, incentive, and enforcement power. So this is yet another. And so in our consideration as we reason with them and ask questions to that idea, we were in that moment considering how we would work, to look at how effective it could possibly be. And we weren't attempting, as we're not right now, to solve it, to figure out if this is the go-to. So my point again is, yes, these are great ideas, these are areas of things where there's a need for them to be addressed. But we are looking also, in addition to that, we're looking at consolidation of themes and functionality. Where do we think we would actually be able to make an impact, right? Where do you think that it would end up with the greatest long-standing sustainable change for New York City? And that would be the priority area. So I care deeply about, as a mother who work as a nurse in New York City, those are personal issues I think have to be addressed right now. But we have to figure out, of all of these themes and areas, which 1, 2, or 3 can we drive the furthest? Which 1, 2, or 3 can stand at the legacy piece to affect greater change when we're no longer a commission?
That's right. Absolutely.
And if I may, we will be going into this a little bit more after we present the themes that we've heard so far. We'll be talking about the work that we have to do in the working groups in a little bit more depth. And that's exactly what the working groups will be doing, is looking at the themes, looking at what we've heard to date, pulling that back. What are those root causes? And then from there, what are the things that we should focus on and put forward to the full commission as priorities as we move towards our preliminary report.
Commissioner Kwan?
Yeah, I think the chair makes a good point, so then the question for me, it comes up to me would be like, can we actually try to invite people who might have influence or power at this point, or people who are actually running some type of program from their perspective, and see what are some of the challenges issue? Because I think we heard a lot from the community, the recipient of these services, that they feel there's like an equal treatment or not equitable treatment. But then can we get that other perspective so that maybe we could build alliances, or maybe just get a perspective of what, the power, folks are seeing from their perspective. At least we can engage them.
Absolutely.
So
Excellent
that would be
point.
my recommendation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I love everyone's comments, and I'm glad these themes have encouraged a lot of conversation already, and I'm sure we'll have much more as well. So why don't we jump right back into it? Right now, we're at the slide, community ownership and asset building. We know we heard this a lot in our housing and planning panels, as well as and in Staten Island and in Brooklyn. So again, just to summarize some of the things that came up, some of the themes, some of the ideas we heard related to barriers, including high interest loans and lack of access to grants that prevented communities or individuals from building community assets or generating wealth. We also heard a lot about NYCHA and its underfunding. We heard about whether the capital-centered approach towards land use and development disempowers BIPOC communities, and whether that same approach, focusing on capital and how vacant land is used in the city, also further divests BIPOC communities from resources like green spaces, gardens, or affordable housing. And then we also heard a general comment about how systems are not generally conducive to cooperative or community ownership. Our next theme is related. It's about community power itself. A lot of co-governance ideas came up, especially again in housing and planning panels. So we heard that government doesn't reflect communities and that it breeds distrust and inhibits participation. Right. So the idea behind that one is that because communities are not at the table, it's hard for them to work with government in general. We also heard comments about community boards and their representations, and that they're not empowered to make substantive changes in their own communities. We heard that the current processes for community engagement that exist now are either not substantive or too complex or inaccessible or undercommunicated, or all of those, in which results in an unempowered community. We heard about existing procedures that do not enable self-determination of communities. And again, we heard a lot about distrust and how a lack of community representation prevents communities from engaging in the decisions about their own neighborhood. And then of course, BIPOC communities are often unempowered to make changes or decisions to the allocations of funds and resources. Another theme that was touched upon in the education panel, as well as in Staten Island and in Brooklyn, was criminalization. So a lot of people talked about the lack of accountability for police abuse, mass incarceration, and how that disproportionately affects BIPOC communities. We heard a direct connection between the lack of culturally competent teachers and how that contributes to over-policing of BIPOC students. We heard folks criticize a deficit-based or punitive education model that focuses on behavioral norms that reinforces policing of students as opposed to other models. And we heard statistics about how BIPOC students face punitive consequences at disproportional rates, as well as suspensions and PD, police department, child in crisis interventions that target BIPOC students. And then the next theme is a big one. We heard a lot about equitable distribution of resources, as well as equitable distribution of responsibilities or burdens. And again, this came up in education, it came up in the housing panel, it came up in the planning panel, as well as in Staten Island and Brooklyn. And the core of that idea is that certain communities are continually underinvested in, and that perpetuates inequities across generations. We heard that historical inequities in public school and after-school resources continue to persist because schools remain systematically underfunded in BIPOC communities, and many people spoke about the need to have an equitable funding model for services. On the other hand, we heard a lot about how burdens or responsibilities are concentrated in BIPOC or low-income communities, such as waste infrastructure, jails, or shelters, as compared to white communities, and how those exacerbate health and economic disparities. And then, of course, we heard that resources are not distributed towards greatest need. And that's the core of this theme, and how that, again, exacerbates inequities. We heard from someone on our planning panel that we need to have equitable, or at least a minimum, access to safe parks and green spaces. Otherwise, we risk undermining the health and public safety of BIPOC communities. And I'll also throw in mental health in there as well. In the health panel, as well as in housing and planning, we heard a lot about procurement. So not just that the procurement process is complex or inaccessible for small businesses and CBOs, but also that community organizations that are looking for these contracts are often underfunded, underutilized, or underempowered, and are unable to therefore get the contracts that they need. We heard specifically about social service workers, many of whom are, of course, BIPOC women, and how the city isn't paying city-funded CBOs enough to give them a thriving life. So the theme behind that one is how the city can leverage its contracting power in different ways to address inequity. I've gone through a lot, so let me see if I should pause there for a second if anyone has comments.
Vice Chair.
A question or comment about what something that Commissioner Bain said very eloquently, which is about, you know, so what happens when you have overlapping, right? I'm not paraphrasing. Overlapping responsibility. So let's say you were to create an agency that would have, you know, some powers around. Let's say for hypothetically you do that, but then you have procurement and equitable distribution of resources, which is a function of the budget, but also a function of policy. And then you have the issue of power, right? You can't talk about criminalization or decriminalization without talking about a budget, right? And the closing facilities. So I guess my question, as we get closer to begin to discern a lot of the stuff that's in here, goes to the core of the mayoral power in the charter, which still establishes and leaves the mayor as the chief executive, right? To make determination with the councils about distribution of resources, but yet the charter leads towards, it's like in a way, it's the law, but it's also a guide, right? So I'm looking at procurement as an example of that. A lot of the procurement changes are done through PPV rules, right? And they get promulgated and changed all the time. Sometimes in the middle of it, they are rules that are established to expedite, you know, prompt payment or any kind of the procurement. But in fact, the application of those ideas to try to make government less bureaucratic in many ways become and are directly responsible for the inequities we're talking. So the linking back to Commissioner Bain's idea of an office that we would ever see in perpetuity. If this commission were to look at the idea of creating an office that would oversee that, and that power in terms of resources, I guess my question would be, is there a point where there's some form of discernible boundary between exceeding what would either be the executive power and that of the city council under the same charter, right? On where you draw the line. If I said, for instance, we're going to create this office and that office shall have no less than 5% of the city's entire budget as part of its portfolio, would we then be taking away some of the responsibilities and power of the council and the mayor to allocate resources? So, I mean, maybe this may be a legal question. I don't know if it is, but I want to make sure to know what our limitations are. Because I tend to shoot for the universe, for the sky, the universe. But I think it would be helpful in the context if we understood that.
Right, right. And I think certainly as we discuss these in the groups, we'll be able to take these questions to legal counsel, but I'll also say that the power in the charter is pretty great to establish not only new offices, but new officials and even put the powers into them.
Or remove offices.
Or remove offices or remove officials. Remove elective offices. So there are many ways to get at the same bite at the apple. And certainly we'll have legal counsel for a more in-depth response.
Absolutely. There are things in the charter that might be derived from state or federal law. Those are basically the things that we can't change because their source is elsewhere. But otherwise, we can make major sweeping changes. The example that you've heard before was the elimination of the Board of Estimate. which was a major structural change that shifted the distribution of power in the city. So it's certainly possible.
Commission member Favors?
So one thing that I noticed that is not necessarily explicitly laid out, but at least based on my memory of the conversations that we've been able to participate in and the comments that we've heard, is that part of what is going to be necessary, and this is not necessarily directly related to a structural change that can be made, but more of a philosophical change, I think, that may need to take place within the mind of the public to better understand the goals that we are striving for. And this was something that Councilmember Brad Lander, I think, pointed out in his commentary when we were in Brooklyn. And that is this notion that at the heart of much of this inequity is an overconsumption or an overconsuming of benefits and power that is taking place within white New York communities. The fact that when we're talking about education, procurement, healthcare, that when we're talking about disparity, what is not being said is that that disparity at the heart of it is that there is an overconsumption of those benefits by particular communities. And as we're thinking about how these things are going to show up on ballot measures, as we're thinking about how we're communicating about these issues, oftentimes in conversations that are equity driven, there is a hesitancy to name the fact that at the heart of inequity is a sizable portion of the community, maybe sizable, perhaps not, that is over consuming relative to their fair share. And as we're having these conversations, even though again, I point this out only because it's not here, but it is certainly something that I think ties through each of these broader themes. There needs to be some thought, I think, to the extent it's not happening already, that has to also be communicated, that we're not talking about creating equity and increasing equity and removing structural barriers in a vacuum. We're talking about moving structural barriers that have been erected to funnel benefits, privilege, and power to specific communities and away from others. And I think it will be helpful as we consider how we move forward, as we consider what the language of these proposals is going to ultimately look like, that we must also be talking in terms of overconsumption of benefits by some communities and how that overconsumption is at its heart, part of what's contributing to these structural inequities. So I just add that because I think that needs to be an open and transparent part of the conversation so that as we're determining what structural change will look like, it is with that understanding.
Very much appreciated. Are there other comments? So
We have a question coming in from Fred Davy on the Zoom here. He writes under education and under the sub-theme of cultural competence, teacher demographics was also raised as a concern. For instance, someone said teacher makeup is 80% white and 80% of that is female. Is the city structurally and systematically supporting and sustaining this level of homogeneity in teaching? And sorry if I misinterpreted anything that I said, Fred.
Sure.
That's perfect.
So I think that part of that does fall within accessibility of government services because it speaks to the ability of that staff to provide culturally relevant and responsive education, but also guidance and also interact with students as it relates to discipline, emotional support, and other areas that students need. I think the question of how diverse is the city's workforce, or whether it's the government itself or the city itself, that's maybe a question that doesn't quite fall under that accessibility theme, but it may fall into one of the later themes, I forget, but it also may come up in another panel as well. But we can look into it. And I think the first theme speaks more to what teachers provide as opposed to the composition of the workforce itself, but certainly something we're abreast of.
So I'm just going to jump in here. I'm appreciating what the point that Commissioner Davey is raising. And this is one of these moments where essentially what we have to do is we have to do the work of discerning, of ascertaining what is the contribution. How much of a role does representation in the education workforce of BIPOC persons contribute to the education, to the educational, to the development and educational attainment of children? You get what I'm saying? Like, and there's a lot of research on it, but that's the work that we have to do to thread the needle. The other point that I just want to throw out, I value this conversation, but what I'm also centering on is just when we look back on all that we've talked about in this conversation, some thoughts are percolating for me that I want you, Jimmy, and Anusha to center on. I'm a little anxious if we delve into the themes, because what I'm hearing in this conversation is that we're talking about marginalization and criminalization of BIPOC communities. We're talking about inequitable consumption / access to basic quality goods and services that ensure well-being. We're talking about inequitable access to opportunities for advancement and wealth building, inequitable environmental protections, inequitable representation and decision-making in service delivery, and then enforcement and accountability. So these themes, the issues that people have brought to the table, what's percolating for me is that it all ties to the overarching, these are our overarching themes, and that may be what we need to be centering on. I want you to keep going, but we may want to pull back for a minute about whether or not we're going to look at education as a group or housing as a group. And maybe what we're looking at is marginalization and criminalization of BIPOC communities. Maybe we're looking at inequitable consumption / access to quality basic goods and services that ensure well-being, and what the charter does to enable that or not allow for that. Procurement, hiring, whatever it may be. Like, it's not, we can't center on every specific problem. It's what is the overarching, what is it speaking to? And maybe those are the groups, how we need to group our work. We're talking here about inequitable access to quality basic goods and services that ensure people's well-being. When we looked in the housing section, that was not per se asset building. That was just quality, affordable, safe housing that ensures your well-being. What is denying people that? And what in the charter do we need to address that will overcome that obstacle? So just, let's keep going, but maybe we want to shift it a little bit more and look at how, like, what are these groupings? Does everybody follow what I'm saying?
No, I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Because when we talk about community and assets, we're talking about like the lack of opportunity for wealth building,
right,
and opportunities for advancement. When we talk about promotions, who gets hired, we're talking about lack of opportunity for advancement. And we need to look at the charter and how the charter allows for that inequity. So, but you're on point.
I think that's absolutely right. And tomorrow afternoon's panel on economic equity may also bring life to that as well.
To that end, my question is, are we going to have the opportunity to hear from city agencies? For instance, in the issue of hiring and diversity, Department of Citywide Administrative Services located in this building has a lot of hiring, promulgates hiring for all many city agencies. Now we're going to hear from agencies in that respect.
Also beyond agencies, but maybe these people who are in power too, maybe
Right,
who have access to resources or controlling the resources now. Because some of them might, have good ideas also, because they might feel that there's a certain restraint on them in terms of how they can allocate resources, right? Just like pension funds, some of the, investment, like from pension funds, etc. So. Yeah.
That's right.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I think, we haven't quite worked out or spoken as a group about how and in which ways we want to hear from city agencies. I think right now, as they are coming up with their own ideas to submit to the charter, they're doing this work day in, day out. There are many folks that are equity minded within agencies. They will have some ideas for us to consider. We could think about how those are then presented to the commission and perhaps even have agencies involved in that. So you have an opportunity to engage directly with them on not only what they're proposing, but also some of the challenges or the ways that they're doing their work. But I think the timing is critical. We're going to get into the process for the working groups, but I think it's important to bring the agencies in when we have a sense of where we may be heading, so that we can really ask pointed questions and I think have that be as productive as possible. My opinion, happy to hear other folks' thoughts on that too.
So I just want to add one more. I realize it's not a city agency, but I think hearing from the city's controller to the extent of pension investments, Commissioner Koo say, but also diversity in registration of contracts and asset management may be a good idea to hear from them from their perspective. Now that we're going to have a new administration coming to the city with the experience of what they've experienced to be there, and maybe their ideas that we may want to hear. And it's not just the agencies, but an agency like that may have a different perspective than we may want to hear as commission.
Absolutely.
Well, two things on Commissioner Garrida's point. I think it would be interesting to hear from the comptroller. I'd also be interested in hearing from some former executives in the comptroller's office, such as Eric Eve, and others who care about racial justice issues, who worked in those spaces before, or maybe even John Liu or others who've held those offices who have insight. I think it'd be good to hear from them as well. I also wanted to make a point that about going back to what Commissioner Davey raised about composition of teachers and the racial and ethnic composition of teachers. I want to make sure we don't conflate cultural competence with some of the other things that I heard being called for. So one was curriculum change to better reflect the diversity and history accurately of the many different folks who attend New York City schools. Like Africa didn't begin with colonization and slavery. There's Africa before that, et cetera, right? So I heard people say that just because someone is Black doesn't mean they know or have been trained, any differently than anybody else, or that they use textbooks that have been written to actually reflect that different history.
Just what the research shows about policing. That
Yes.
Just because you have a Black officer does not mean that a Black officer is not going to engage in, biased, racialized practices. Yeah.
Yes, so I think that's,
Fair.
a separate point that if we're going to summarize education, I think it's a very important one to include. And the other thing I heard was that kids are not being trained in critical thinking skills and interactive skills, which is how you develop critical thinking skills, but more in a cognitive accountability, which is like memorize the mathematical tables and 2 + 2 = 4 and 1 + 1 = 2, but they aren't taught that the linear model 1 + 1 = 2 doesn't work if you're measuring heat and oxygen. It only works between 32 degrees and 212 degrees. You go 1 degree above, you no longer have water. You're in a qualitatively different space.
Right.
And they aren't taught that, oh, you have to qualify these additive models according to the substance you're looking. That's a next level of critical thinking, which in programming and all these other newly emerging fields, That's what folks are looking for. And so I thought that is a distinct point also, that we are training kids to occupy certain occupations, but not at the highest level of, you know, what's out there needed in the economy where they're going to be able to succeed and be leaders, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that was a very important point too, that I
Absolutely.
didn't want to see just lost.
Right, and to your point, and I'll just, this is why I'm trying to figure out what is the most appropriate frame? And that's part of what we're doing here this afternoon, part of the discussion that we want to have as commissioners, is because how we frame this is going to determine, you know, what rocks we're looking up under, what we're looking for in the charter. And so when I hear you talk about education, what I think to myself is, and this goes back to the point that Commissioner Daniel Favors was making about consumption, inequitable consumption, and then how that, you know, you've got to look at kind of two sides of the slate, right? There's the inequitable lack of access, and then there's over consumption, right? And what contributes to that? And so when I hear you talk about education, I can't help but think that is the overarching inequitable access / consumption to basic quality goods and services that ensure well-being. And then you have under that, what does that look like in education? What does that look like in healthcare? What does that look like in housing? You know, what does that look like, you know, health and mental health? And then you look at, you know, what the issues are, the points that people have presented to us. And we have to figure out, what is it in the charter? What are those elements, those laws in the charter that are going to allow us to move the lever on all of this? Because we're not going to be able to hit every specific issue in education, every specific issue in housing. So you have to figure out, what is that underlying structural issue that if we make that change, and then we couple it with some other changes that assure enforcement and accountability, we can catch the issues. But you have to call it out. So I'm with you. I'm just saying that it may not be delineated, because if we delineate everything, it may be 1,500 things. So how do we make sure that we're catching, using what people are bringing to us, catching what is the overarching inequity that's presented, and then making sure that we structurally go in there and gut out what allows for that and replace it with that which is going to control for it or control against it. I'm sorry, Vice Chair.
I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, that I want to be clear that we're talking about K-12 education. Because when you look at diversity among the teachers I represent, early childhood, after school, Head Start, diversity is it's the opposite, right? It's like you have more diversified workforce, yet they're getting paid substantially less. So the role of the nonprofit to deliver early childhood education, 3K, pre-K, and then after school program, we haven't talked about. And I think by extension, the role of higher education, although CUNY is a function of the state and the city universities have also a diversity issue. So that when we talk about education, personally, I want to make sure that this is not just a K-12 education, because when you're talking about procurement, well, we're procuring contracts for nonprofit and paying teachers $20,000 less than the same teachers that are teaching our kids in a K-12 education. If we're going to talk about inequities, we're going to talk about diversity. Here you have a diversified workforce where mostly people of color are represented, and they're making paid, $15,000 less, and we're questioning diversity in a K-12 education, and they're getting substantially more. And not only getting more in salaries, but getting more in access to educational training. They can go to Adelphi, and this is no disrespect to my brothers and brethren in the UFT or anybody else. I just think that if we're going to talk about that in this space, we need to expand the concept of education beyond K-12 and look at early childhood education, after school, Head Start, and look at CUNY, even if it's for city universities, because it is part of our procurement. And it is a policy that we're pursuing right here. So I want to make sure that we don't leave those members out.
Yes, so yes, and what I would add to that is that what I want us to also look at is how job segregation contributes to that. Why is it that Black and brown women are more often relegated to early childhood programming, and it's not seen as quality and value add, right? So we have to look at it in terms of wages and opportunity, but we also have to look at this notion of job segregation, how our society determines who should be in what roles and how they are and how they are valued. And that gets into your structural.
If I may note, Commissioner Davey has made a point on this. He writes, are there structural systemic issues that create lack of representation?
That's what I'm talking
Yes,
about.
teacher certification is a key one.
Exactly.
Right? The people I represent have to pay between $7,000 and $8,000 out of pocket to get certified.
Right.
Right? And the city covers them from the K to 12 education if you're in a city workforce. So you start from the perspective, you're in a deficit.
Right.
To begin with, right? And who has that amount of money? And to the issue of diversity, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the $400 that it takes to take a civil service exam, in some instances, how do you begin to have a conversation to have community access to people who may be half of the rent?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to talk about this from the perspective to talk about those levers. And, it's good to talk about curriculum, and I'm all for it, Phil. I think, Commissioner, I'm sorry, that we should talk about curriculum, and that curriculum should not just be doing K to 12. But if we're going to address the serious problems that we have, those inequities that you spoke about, Madam Chair, we have to be honest and say, hey, listen, those are some of the roadblocks that begin with that create a segregated society.
Yes.
And a segregated education system.
Absolutely. And then what is the city willing to do about that? Or what are we going to push the city to do about that?
Right.
Commissioner Yu and then Commissioner Favors.
Is it on? Yep. So BIPOC communities come from communities where we didn't even know how to get information to even get on the socioeconomic realm. And so there are people, immigrants, for instance, come here, they want to be able to access, going to college and being teachers or, whatever, but the system isn't set up to help them and everything is like a hunt and peck process and nobody knows what to do, right? And so everybody comes here and there's long, so many diverse communities and immigrants and, New Yorkers that it's almost like everybody's doing there isn't any continuation, right? You kind of hunt and peck for yourself and your family because there isn't a system that really helps you to navigate. And it's really hard to find that.
Yes.
That is relevant to you. So I think that's something that, we also need to think about.
Absolutely. Commissioner Favors.
So I think that it's important to have a both and as opposed to an either or approach, particularly when we're talking about something like education. Because even if we did have that equity that we're speaking of in terms of representation as it pertains to the numbers, if the educators that we're talking about in this hypothetical are trained through the same types of teacher preparation programs, which still center curriculums that are grounded in the higher value placed on whiteness and the ability to access whiteness, then we are simply replicating, I'm reminded, as African nations are throwing off colonial leadership without having put substantive thought into what new systems would look like, we often ended up with situations where those same structures were in place. They were just populated with people from within those communities. So it would be a travesty to me if we were to focus on the numerical representation in an example like this without also looking at the substantive curricular aspect of what it means to be taught that in order to successfully navigate the education system, one must master whiteness in terms of history, knowledge, and approach to academic learning. So I would hope that as we're thinking about these structures, that we are definitely holding space for the example that Commissioner Garrido just mentioned, because I think that the numbers themselves are devastating, particularly since we know that those numbers have fallen off a cliff ever since Brown v. Board of Education. But it would be a really missed opportunity if we did not also look at the substance of what children are expected to master in order to demonstrate academic excellence. And so long as they are still being required to master accessing whiteness as a tool or a pathway for academic excellence, if you have to take a Regents exam that asks you two ways to mention two ways or to state two ways that British imperialism benefited Nigeria, for example, which was an actual question on the Regents exam, it doesn't matter if it's a Black teacher or a BIPOC teacher that's teaching you that information, you are still being taught to view the world through the benefits that whiteness and its accessibility can provide. So I think that as we're moving forward and as we're sort of fine tuning what the actual structural underpinnings are, I would hope that we are able to take a both and approach, so that we're looking at those structural numerics, because I think that is vitally important. Shout out to CUNY. But as we're looking at those numbers, it would be a missed opportunity if we are not also talking about the substance that children are expected to master, because that also contributes to lifelong inequity.
So what you're saying builds on what Commission Member Thompson was speaking to. And I think that, I don't think that you have any argument in this room. What I am saying is that when we look at what inequitable access to / consumption of quality basic goods and services that promote and ensure well-being, you have to look at the education bucket. And then you have to look at what contributes to that inequity. And the research does greatly shows that what children are being taught and how they're being taught influences, informs, and shapes their educational development, their attainment, their growth, their maturation. So that's when you then look at what is the change we need to make here. And we're gonna have to map that out. But overall, what we're trying to ultimately get to is ensuring greater equity in access to and consumption of those basic goods and services that promote and ensure well-being for everyone. You get what I'm saying? So we're there. We have to map it and make sure that at the end of the day, while we may be centering on, this is what I meant, Commissioner Thompson, while we may have something in there about curriculum, and we may have something in there about the numbers, the overarching concern is addressing the inequity. And so there may be this overarching structural change with some elements of it. I'm sorry, Commissioner Thompson.
Well, I want to make 2 points. One, just agreement with Commissioner Favors. There was a book in the 1970s by an economist, Michael Puri, which was a cross-national study of social status and then occupation and wages, occupational prestige and wages. And what this study found, and Puri is a very well-established, well-known economist, what it found was that wages and occupational status follow social status, not the other way around. So if you find a country or profession that's predominantly women worldwide, that becomes a lower status occupation and a lower paid occupation. Similarly, it's done, that's how the system works, right? Globally. So in Russia, doctors tend to be women. It's doesn't pay that well because it's women. And so the conclusion of the book is, if you really want to change the way occupational status and wages are distributed, you have to tackle how people are categorized and perceived, and you have to go after race, and you have to go after gender. And that was the conclusion of the book. It's not like the occupations themselves deserve or
That's right.
blah, 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 this kind of money or that kind of money. That was like the book. So I think that argues for both ends. Like, we need definitely to tackle the inequalities amongst, teachers, according really to who they are. But in order to do that, we also have to re-educate folks
I think we have to
to be
re-educate.
even outraged. So that was one point
Yes.
I wanted to make.
Let me just
Mhm.
reply to that. We have to re-educate, but that's also where part of that kind of centering in the preamble. Like, what do we value? What do we believe?
Well, that was going to be my second. one.
Right.
But I think you're exactly that. I think the preamble, or at least we should think about the preamble setting out, what does it take to thrive?
Mm-hmm.
What does it take to thrive? You know, and then once we identify and put there, what does it take to thrive?
Mhm.
Maybe it's not life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but some more stuff, right?
That's right.
Once we say, what does it take to thrive? Then we can say, okay, and how about access and distribution of who gets
Mm-hmm.
those things?
Absolutely.
And one cautionary note I would put in there, one of the things I think it takes for everyone to thrive is some common belief in common set of values, like we all are human beings
Right.
who have equal potential and equal, and doesn't matter where we come from, that kind of thing, because without that, none of this other stuff makes sense. But I agree wholly
We're on
with
the
that.
same
I think
page.
that would make the preamble a
That's the preamble,
valuable,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
it fits, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we're consistent.
I
how we lay it out.
agree.
Hello? Great. I'm ready to actually go into the next one because I think it responds to the comments of the vice chair and the deputy mayor as well. So this next one is a big one. It's measurement of disparate impacts and remedying disparities in quote unquote race neutral decision making. And I think some people might see that as separate, but we brought these together because one, these came up in every single panel, and two, that some of the mechanisms that have been discussed may overlap as well. So just to summarize this a little bit, it's the idea behind this theme is that one, we need to know what disparate impacts exist across race or other identities in a discrete enough way to be able to act upon it. And then we need to look at what criteria is used in society and whether those are tied to the disparate impacts themselves, including in the composition of the workforce, including in how people are paid. So some of the things that we've heard which fall under that are about fair share regulations and whether they're sufficient or not. We also heard about the racial wealth gap. And we heard about city employee exam and promotion processes and how those are difficult to navigate and lack transparency. And so if we had a way to measure that, then we could elucidate what about that process actually is causing that. We heard about that simply there's not enough mechanisms to identify or enforce against disparate impacts. And we heard that for many people, that the city or other entities can use quote unquote race neutral criteria in application of the policy that produces unequal outcomes based on racial lines. The next slide is a continuation of this. This is just such a large category that we heard over and over about. We heard that recruitment practices and healthcare staffing do not reflect communities being served because of those types of criteria. And we heard that there's a lack of DOE oversight in terms of specifically looking at racial equity monitoring and rule enforcement. So this is a pretty big one that not only spans health, education, housing, and planning, but presumably would come up again and again in the panels that we have, especially economic equity coming up and fair legal system as well. The next slide is a theme that's a little more discrete. It's about mental health.
Wait, may I? Before we leave this?
Sure.
So one of the issues, and I acknowledge I'm the one who raised it, was in Queens. But the way we measure MWBE, for example, it's women, generic, defined, definite women. Then it's Black, Latino, Asian. There is no category for Black women, Latinx women, Asian women. So when we
Interesting.
measure who gets contracts according to our criteria that I believe may be defined in legislation, we don't see, unless we ask for it, how many women of color get contracts. We just see women. But if you look at how many women of color get contracts, it's like Black women, it's like less 2% or less, Latino, Latinx 2% or less, Asian women similarly, and white women 35%, 33% of the contracts, even though, you know, it's very disproportionate.
Absolutely.
And so women of color are invisible. So I just want to note as an issue, do we want to address that? Like the way we characterize MWBE, and this cuts across all programs, makes women of color, at least I'm saying, invisible. Literally, you don't collect and show the data of how they're doing, and they're not doing well. So I just want to make that as a measurement issue.
And certainly the way we conceptualize this includes that because it highlights the need to have data at discrete enough levels to disaggregate that data, whether it's women of color, whether it's different types of Asian populations, whether it's different types of Black populations, to collect that data at small enough or detailed enough levels that you can
I'm being very
identify.
specific.
Right.
I'm not talking about Haitian versus Jamaican versus, I'm talking about women of color specifically, because I think the disparities are greater there than in variations amongst types of Blackness or variations amongst types of Latinx or et cetera. I think there's a real issue here of Black, Latinx, and Asian women.
Madam Chair, for that point, I think this is a real, critical question when you get to the issue of procurement, between this relationship between the PPB, right, the Procurement Policy Board promulgating rules, the Mayor's Office of Contract supposedly enforcing the rules, but then everybody does, pardon my language, whatever the hell they want by city agencies, and then they interpret their own rules. And so to that point, the idea of the creation of an agency that oversees is a power is, do we take a Mayor's Office of Contract and beef them up to give them full procurement, right? With the understanding that these rules will have to change over that to implement what are lofty goals, but never get implemented because they just sit well on a piece of paper and say, we're going to procure 20% of this. And it's a lot of it is like, has an under theme to it. Or do we just do away with, to your point, Anusha, within agency completely and create a new one? I think it's an interesting discussion for us to have, because I believe in the experiences that we have on the issue of power that we started with. If you form an agency, I don't care how big it is, I don't care what you call it, and you don't empower them to make those decisions and to set those inequities that Commissioner Thompson said right, then what are you really doing? I'm tired of lofty ideas that sit on a shelf where we put great reports that shows what we already know, which is inequities that exist in the system. And I've seen that with promotion, I've seen it with NWBs, we've seen it everywhere. But unless you really empower someone, an agency, an entity to really have the authority to make the things right, then why create one, right? So I think that's a big challenge for all of us, Phil.
Right.
Because we've seen the application of so many good ideas, and in the end, they end up perpetuating the same inequities or actually making them worse, to the point that Commissioner Favors said.
So let me share that I hear, I understand, I agree. What I am, as you all speak, what I am like, continually doing in my head is trying to figure out, how do you organize and structure to, you know, to ensure that we're addressing the points that you're raising, the very critical points that you're raising, while at the same time appreciating that there may be 5 other like points. And so when I hear you talk about MWBE and the very issue that you raise, which is hugely problematic, and it's something that in the society they've known about, but they don't really document it. We know the same thing, you know, manifests in procurement for city contracts. We know now from conversation, you know, from input of people in the community that we see it just even in working in government. The city council report about the experience of women of color in terms of, you know, being employed and getting ahead and being paid. Different elements and aspects of it. And so what I'm centering on is how do we structure in such a way that we're dealing with the overarching issue of inequity in work with or working with city government, right? That's a large looming, it's a constant theme that is surfacing. And it may be in vendor contracts with the city of New York. It may be in appointments and promotions within the city of New York. It may, you know, it may be pension contracts. It may be construction contracts. It may be community-based organization contracts. But the overarching issue is there is an inequity in how we, you know, in who does business, who works for, how we capture that data, how we manage it. And our aim as a charter has to be that we identify the areas and we try to figure out how we come up with a proposal that speaks to those specific areas, but that also captures the ones we don't know about, the ones that are flying under the radar, and we know absolutely nothing about them because nobody surfaced them. So again, it's that both and.
Right.
And so, I mean, I'm with you. So when you see me, like, you know, I'm just trying to piece it together because we're not going to catch every one. Let's make sure that we identify the ones we need that are out there, create the response, and then ensure that that response also begins to dismantle that which hasn't even been brought to our attention.
I want to note at this point in time that we are at the scheduled close time of our meeting. If folks are okay staying a bit longer, I think it would be beneficial to do so. Does that work?
I think it would be beneficial. At the same time, I want to honor people's time. People came, they showed up. We had some technical difficulties. So if we're going to go another 5 to 10 minutes, let's do that, but let's center on kind of how we're going to move forward. Is that fair? Okay.
Sounds good. Would it be worth Jimmy quickly going through the remainder of the deck, or would you like to digest it in print?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we can all read it. That's my
Okay.
personal
Okay.
opinion.
Okay.
I also wanted to just to comment on what Commissioner Jones Austin just said, in that I think what Commissioner Garrido has suggested a few times was that we also, given the things that you just noted, things we see, things that are unseen, but captured within a theme. I think Commissioner Garrido was saying maybe that's an argument for an agency or some body that will continue to dig into these things.
Absolutely.
I just want to note that.
You know, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think that it's going to come down to, we're going to come up with structural changes, but then there's going to have to be this continuing review, enforcement, and accountability mechanism. Because we're not going to, even if we capture it and we make the change, we've seen time and time again that something gets embedded in the charter and then it's not carried out. So again, I think it's kind of that both and setting the stage for what will come next.
Can I, and to that
Please.
point, I think Commissioner, you talked about language access as an example of that. So, we went through this whole thing about local law 68, which then turned into local law 35 and the implementation language access. And the idea was that city agencies would submit to the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs their plan on how to implement language access. And then that office will promulgate what was deficient about it. But then we found ourselves being deviated by budget concerns and by all kinds of language access and, phone access for that. And it turns out that the discussion, for instance, about police department, when you pick up a phone and call 911 and you want to ask for a specific language, was tied more to the police budget than it was tied to a language access. And extricating those things that still gave access or presented hurdles, I think you talked about barriers, Jimmy, was something that even with well-intentioned, well-structured, didn't carry out well. And I know that the time of our commission is limited, right? And at some point, we're going to dissolve and go to the public. But to the point of the agency, the creation of the agency and the idea, I think Commissioner, you put it, but it's the idea of accountability behind it. And so who responds to what to implement these ideas, even when you have an overarching agency?
Absolutely.
So perhaps the idea is that if we're going to look at things that are looking at this in perpetuity, or at least as long as the entity exists, then we need to make sure to see that if we have the ability as a charter commission to empower that agency, so not just look at the report, but actually said to the agency, well, we have the power to say your plan doesn't go far enough.
Right.
Or your plan, and whether it's procurement or any of the access of the idea, that power goes to the center of what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And if we have the power to do that, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. And I think that what we need to look at, and we've talked about this before, is if there is such an office, where does that office sit in the government, the overall New York City government structure? Is it an office independent of the mayor's office? Right? I mean, do you to really ensure that separation of power? And then what is the enforcement mechanism that attends? One point, Anusha?
For the record, I want to note that Commissioner Davey has noted that he strongly endorses a monitoring and accountability entity. For the record.
So our next steps.
So next steps, we've heard some very valuable feedback on how we've organized the information to date. We intend to move into working groups where we can really get deeper into the root cause to identify areas for further and deeper exploration, including looking at the charter itself. I think we've discussed here a little bit of a reorganization from what you have seen prior. So we will follow up with you on what will constitute those groups and how we group both topics and people in them. So in the meantime, please do reach out if you have any thoughts on that. But we will need to move into groups rather quickly because we have a pretty short timeline until the end of September when we intend to release our preliminary report. So thank you for your work that we will see in the working groups. Staff will be on those as well, working alongside you, supporting with research, supporting with legal analysis. And we very much look forward to that next phase of our work as we continue to hear from communities and from folks on our issue area panels.
Thank you. I want to thank both Jimmy and Anusha for walking us through the input that we've received to date. More to come, actually Wednesday, August 11th from 5 to 8 p.m. We'll be at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. That is our Manhattan convening. And then Thursday, the 19th, we will be in the Bronx at a location to be determined. And then we have 2 virtual public input sessions on the 23rd and 26th of August, and one final one, the Wednesday or Thursday in the, I guess, the first full week of September, September 8th or 9th in person. I want to take a minute to thank all of the team, the staff and the leadership of the Racial Justice Commission for the work that they have done to date in just organizing and planning everything from the substantive work to the scheduling, getting us where we need to be, making sure that the mics are working, people in position. You all have done a tremendous job. And every time I think about the fact, right? And we're really, I mean, we're talking about the team is still building. And so, it's been about 4 full months, but just tremendous work. And I thank you all for everything you're doing. And I cannot express enough my appreciation for my fellow commission members. Seeing you out and about, seeing you here this afternoon, being able to see you virtually and participating. We're all committed to this, and we're committed to achieving the best outcomes that we can for the commission, but more importantly for the people, the communities here in New York. And so I thank you. We are adjourning this meeting, and we will reconvene before I adjourn. When's our next public meeting? September.
Wrong calendar. Oh, geez, it is early September.
Do we have a date?
September 14th.
September 14th, we'll have our next public meeting of the commission. But of course, we'll be seeing each other several times before then. So thank you all. The meeting is adjourned. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very good.
How far up East Broadway do you live?